Hi, everyone. This is our presentation on language and education policy for English language learners. So this presentation really aims at just providing some background information on the policy, especially as it surrounds like success for all students, but this subgroup of English language learners. And I do think it's important to kind of have this in the back of your mind, especially the background and like the historical perspective, so you can understand like what progression has been made in our country. Since the implementation of these different like state policies, but then also it makes you aware of like what you're kind of responsible for and required to do as just a regular content area teacher who may have an English language learner in your class. So the guiding questions that this presentation aims to address are: how has the policy context surrounding the education of ELLs changed in the United States? So we'll talk about the progression and the development of all of that. How do national state-led consortia and individual state policies and initiatives influence the education of ELLs on the local district and school levels? So how these larger state requirements and state policies then filter down to us specifically in our districts and schools. How have the courts influenced the education of ELLs? So some major court cases that go along with this. And how can educators use their understanding of the policy and legislative context surrounding ELL education to enhance their English language learners' access to educational opportunities? So understanding this to then really become an advocate for your students and making sure they're getting what's deserved to them. Let me hide this for a second, or remove it at least. So the historical perspective, and this is like how we've gotten to where we are today. Many people typically have this belief that the challenge of educating English language learners and this need for supporting them and having these special programs are just a relatively recent issue or phenomena. However, we know this to be false. It may be on our radar a little bit more, but it's been the case for many years that we've had English language learners in a public school type of setting. Many people also assume that English is the official language of the United States, but interestingly enough, the Constitution has never been amended to declare that English is the official language. So that sometimes becomes the counter argument for a lot of these special programs. These students need to learn English. We typically hear comments like that, but knowing that it isn't officially the language according to our own government documents. Bilingual education has existed for a long time, since the 17th century, with German bilingual education that's offered throughout the United States, especially in parts of Pennsylvania. So this is very unique to our state. But yes, we've seen this education for quite some time. And language minorities have always been part of the American landscape, but their unique languages and cultural perspectives had not always been warmly welcomed by broader society. And so that's part of this course also, right? We're learning how to better support our English language learners, but there's this other component here where we should also be bringing not just their language perspectives, but also cultural perspectives into our classroom. And then restrictions on languages other than English tend to come in waves, and language restrictionism is usually tied to other forms of discrimination. And so that's just some of the historical perspective on it. So here's the evolution of policy in our government. So federal involvement in the history of language diversity is fairly recent. And this is, when we're talking about federal government, we're talking about nationwide, not specific to states. The federal government has great interest in ensuring that the country has well-educated citizens, but because of a lack of jurisdiction, the best it can do is offer funding to supplement state and local funding for schools. So I'm sure you've discussed this in other classes, but public schools are typically governed by states. That's why so many things may vary and be different from state to state, and that's because each state is in charge of education. And although the federal government wants to kind of further ensure that its citizens are being educated to a certain quality, because that jurisdiction falls to the state, the federal government can only kind of do so, can only ensure up to a certain point, but as it's attached to funding, because we know that states get their funding from the federal government. And so it's this very like kind of complicated thing where the federal government wants to create these sort of like standards, but that's left up to the state. So they're trying to kind of influence it as best they can with funding. So the catch is that if states accept the funding, then they have to follow the federal education policies. They're agreeing to that if they're going to accept funding, which many states do because they need that. Currently, all states accept federal funding. Therefore, all states are subject to federal law, meaning that because they accept it, they're now agreeing to it. And federal funding makes up less than 10% of each school's funding. Title VII Bilingual Education Act, and this ran from 1968 to 2002, which is really quite a long span of time, provides grants to school districts and other eligible entities through a competitive grant process. And since 1968, the ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, has been reauthorized 6 different times, resulting in changes. The focus on helping English language learners achieve fluency in English always remained constant. So that was always something that we saw in that sort of policy. Then came No Child Left Behind. And with this federal policy, we see that Title VII Bilingual Education Act was replaced with a Title III, Language Instruction for Limited English Proficient and Immigrant Students. They never make it brief and easy to remember. It's always a very long title. And so English language learner issues are also addressed in No Child Left Behind Title I, improving the academic achievement of economically disadvantaged. And that's because, and we've talked about this since week 1, a large population of our English language learners also fall into like districts and schools that would be considered economically disadvantaged. Any program for English language learners must meet 2 requirements: teach English and teach academic content as the state has outlined it. So as it's outlined in state English language proficiency and academic standards. So still, even though you're teaching English and delivering the academic content, you still need to make sure you're meeting those state standards. That's pretty much what it's saying. Unlike Title VII, Title III, so this is what was revamped with No Child Left Behind, Title III includes no recognition of the personal and societal benefits for bilingual education and bilingualism. The sole focus is English. So this idea of students learning 2 languages at once, that's been kind of minimized with No Child Left Behind, and the focus was really on just English. And so you have to look at that really from like an ethical standard, like how right is that, especially for a student who identifies in more than one culture. The Obama administration and the federal education policy then kind of moves in and starts to take place, and Obama expressed support for bilingual education and criticized No Child Left Behind. So if you haven't discussed No Child Left Behind, once Obama then became president, we saw that No Child Left Behind was replaced by other policies I'm about to get into. And he was very open about criticizing the fact that bilingual education was minimized. So English language learners advocate and others have expressed deep concerns that the emphasis on high stakes testing remains. So this concern that testing is, so high stakes and there's such a focus on it still. As states scramble to comply with No Child Left Behind, we technically have over 50 different sets of standards and assessments with varying degrees of rigor and expectations. And because it is from state to state, and so it can vary widely, This system makes it difficult to make meaningful comparisons across states, particularly for English language learners. And there's a lot of research out there. Like if a student is proficient in English in Pennsylvania, does that transfer? Does that really mean that they're proficient in another state if they were to move? Because these tests are so can be so different. So particularly ELs, as each state defines identities, assesses, and designates them in different ways. We also see the Common Core State Standards Initiative and how this has played a role. So this initiative is a state-led effort to develop language arts and mathematics standards that states voluntarily adopt. So some states have agreed to it, some states have not, but this is, a state-led thing. Common Core also described as rigorous, internationally benchmarked college and career-ready next generation standards that are designed to raise the bar and ensure that all high school graduates are prepared for academic rigors of college coursework and the demands of the workforce. So the reason why they're so popular, Common Core standards are so popular, is because it really does focus on preparing the student for post-secondary, whatever that might be. And that's where it says college and career ready. So that's what these standards are focused on, really keeping in mind, like what happens to our students once they leave, how are we preparing them in that regard. Critics, though, of Common Core question why they've been adopted so widely without field testing. So oftentimes there's a lot of tests and studies that go along with it. And so this has been kind of questioned, and whether they really are a state-led effort or something else is behind it. English language learner advocates and experts are divided over the implications of Common Core for English language learners. So there's no one clear perspective on it from those people who advocate for English language learners. And so we just see that people are they either are for it or against it for different reasons. 2 state consortia have received federal funding to develop next-generation language arts and mathematics assessments designed to measure student achievement. So now that we have these standards in place, we see that assessments are being designed from the state to measure student achievement. And both consortia are developing a series of online formative and summative computer-based tests to be administered at different points throughout a school year that will require schools to have access to a substantial number of sophisticated computers and fast and reliable internet access. We know how important technology is and how large of a role it can play. So, as we're taking a look at the English language proficiency assessment consortia, this is now the group of people who are developing tests to gauge a student's language proficiency, especially in English. And this is really WIDA. I know I've mentioned WIDA a few times, but now we're seeing more in depth what WIDA is. It's the World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. So that's what it stands for, but it's the state consortium that started in Wisconsin, was established in 2002 to develop common English language proficiency standards and assessments to comply with Title III of No Child Left Behind. The developed English language assessment is called Assessing Comprehension and Communication in English State to State for English language learners, but it's often referred to as Access for ELLs, and that's the name of the test that students are taking to gauge their language proficiency. By 2012, the Access for ELLs assessment had been fully administered to nearly 1 million language learners across 27 states. And in 2012, WIDA revised their language development standards called the Application of WIDA English Language Development Standards. And a lot of that was based off of these tests and how we could update it. So now we're looking at state policies here. So the policy scene changes dramatically after voters in 3 states with large English language learner populations approved English for the Children initiatives, and that placed severe restrictions on bilingual education. And so this idea that English should be the focus and nothing else. The initiatives were authored, funded, and led by a California millionaire software developer who ignored the history, purpose, and design of bilingual programs. So someone outside of education who just is not aware of what we do and how beneficial these programs could be. He claimed that bilingual programs are a violation of immigrant children's right to learn English and used misleading statistics and data in making the case for eliminating bilingual education programs. So despite a lot of backlash and opposition, bilingual education programs are still thriving, even in California, Arizona, and Massachusetts, those states that were mentioned. So we still see there, despite all of this, there are still many bilingual programs that continue to exist. So here are the important court decisions and legislation that goes around, focuses around English language learners. Typically, there's been reluctance by many states throughout the country to provide equitable education opportunities to ELLs and other minority students. This really has had it should not be a surprise. We see tons of court decisions constantly focusing on the inequitability of education for one subgroup over another. And so the fact that English language learners are just another subgroup that have to fight for their rights, it's sad, but it should not be surprising. And there are, of course, controversies over the use of languages other than English in public schools that have sparked many lawsuits. So the first one here is Brown versus the Board of Education, which you've probably, if you've done any sort of, background to education type of class or an education law class, this is always like a seminal case that's discussed. But along with other segregation cases, this case in particular, Brown versus the Board of Education, has made it clear that English language learners cannot be fully separated from other students throughout their education under this guise or this false belief of helping them learn English. So it's the idea that they cannot be separated because we're trying to help them learn. If that's the guise, we need to be, integrated. And then there was Lau versus Nichols in 1974, and this was especially important for English language learners. And it says here, perhaps one of the most important court decisions. So in this court case, it was stated there's no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. And so with this court case in particular, we see it occurred in California, and there were a group of students who did not speak English and were fighting for their own rights with their, local public school. And it was decided through a court previously to this that fine, they can come to school and we'll give them everything that the other kids have. And so even though they were given the same, desks and the same classrooms and the same textbooks, and they were learning from the same teachers and it was the same curriculum, they still didn't have access to that education because they didn't understand the language. And so when it finally got to the Supreme Court, it was decided that just because you've given them all of these things, they can't access it. They can't walk away with any sort of meaningful education because they don't know the language. And so this is where we see that it was determined pretty much that there needs to be a, language instruction in some way or another so that they can access the education, that meaningful education. Then we see the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights created the Lau remedy. So this is in response to the court case, to go after districts that were ignoring the needs of ELL. So now they're seeking out districts that aren't following this legislation. And the Equal Education Opportunities Act in 1974 was federal law of Lau remedy. So Lau remedies then turns into this Equal Education Opportunities Act. And that's what we currently see today. So at the local level, that was federal Supreme Court type issues. At the local level, we see that federal and state policies for English language learners have raised awareness that schools are responsible for meeting the needs of this group of students. We can't just disregard them because there's an added layer of, development that's required. Schools and districts ought to outline a language policy as the first step to assuming the responsibility of meeting English language learners' needs. And then in 2001, Corson outlines 3 policy principles for multilingual settings like the United States. So, children have the right to be educated in their home language. If the first principle cannot be met, children have the right to attend a school that respects and values their home language. So if they cannot be educated in their home language, then they have the right to attend a school that at least respects and values that language. And children have the right to learn the standard language variety, so standard English in the United States, to the highest level of proficiency possible. So just to wrap this up, a few points to just kind of reiterate. Our country has a long history of bilingual education through direct federal involvement, and that essentially began with Title VII Bilingual Education Act in 1968. Over 30 years of federal funding and support for bilingual education came to an abrupt end, a very, very abrupt end in 2001 with No Child Left Behind, because the focus then switches totally to English. And while bilingual education is still allowed, No Child Left Behind makes it clear that whatever English language learner program districts choose to offer, they have to ensure that English language learners learn English as quickly as possible. And we see that this is really a trend that has been moving out. And since the Obama administration took office, that's been kind of pushed away and replaced. The court plays a significant role in the development of policy for English language learners and have made it clear that language minorities have the right to teach their children their home language through private language classes. Schools cannot ignore linguistic and academic needs of English language learners, that programs for English language learners must be based on sound education theory, meaning attached to standards, and that English language programs must be provided with adequate resources and properly trained teachers, which is an issue we still see today. It was in my own experience, I've seen this, where we don't have TESOL or ESL, whatever the term is at your school, we don't have those teachers in the classroom supporting these students with language development. And this is where I think SIOP model does a great job at offering a support for a content area teacher, because you may find that to be true when you get into the classroom. And that programs must be evaluated to ensure that they are sufficient in meeting student needs. So with a strong understanding of history and the limitations of and potential opportunities provided by current language and education policies, teachers can effectively work with their districts and schools to develop their own language policies and procedures, especially because hopefully, this very unique group of language learners that are specific to your school. So then you can then create stuff that supports them best because you know them better. All right, let me know if you have any questions.